Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Kelli Morgan, and today I am honored to take you inside From Beale to Bourbon Street, an extraordinary exhibition by artist and my friend Najee Dorsey that is presented at Black Art in America's Art Gallery. The blues is more than a musical style. It's the heartbeat of Black American resilience, love, migration, and creativity. Born in the Mississippi Delta at the end of the 19th century, the blues gave voice to the daily lives and struggles of African Americans navigating a brutal Jim Crow South. As people moved north and west during the Great Migration, the blues migrated too, evolving in juke joints, on street corners, and eventually electrifying cities like Memphis and New Orleans. Beale Street in Memphis and Bourbon Street in New Orleans became iconic places where the blues not only survived, but thrived, shaping the soundscape of jazz, rock, soul, and so much more. In From Beale to Bourbon Street, Dorsey pays homage to the blues as a living archive of Southern memory. The richly layered mixed media works, Naji invites us to feel the spirit of the blues. Its deep, melancholy, playful humor, and unyielding power. Najee's work doesn't just represent the musicians. It recreates the atmosphere of the street corners, the clubs, and the vibrant communities that nurtured this music. His signature collage style combines vintage photography, texture painting, and historical iconography to produce a visual language that feels as improvisational as the blues itself. Let's take a deeper dive into some key works in the show. In Time Traveler, Najee masterfully combines found objects, historical photographs, and mixed media to construct a sculptural figure that stands as both monument and vessel. The work layers vintage portraits, clocks, reflective plates, and again, symbolic artifacts onto the torso and the legs, which evokes this idea of the Black body as a living archive, right, of memory, labor, and migration. Cotton balls and textured fabric along the legs reference agricultural history, as well as the often overlooked contributions of African Americans to American textile history, right? Textile production, both as cotton laborers, of course, right? But textile production in the North, right? So slavery in the North. Something else that I would add here too is the prevalence, right, of Black female designers, right, and Black female dressmakers, lace makers, right? Like so many Black women, particularly in the port towns, right? Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, from which, Najee has historical, and ancestral roots. Mobile, Alabama, right? You had Black women who were the fashion designers, right? Who were the seamstresses, for white mistresses, right? White slave owners. Women like Mary Todd Lincoln, for instance, right? Abraham Lincoln's wife, Elizabeth Keckley, was her exclusive seamstress, as a matter of fact. And Keckley also designed and sold for Jefferson Davis's wife. And if you don't know who Jefferson Davis is, he was the president of the Confederacy, right, during the Civil War years. Keckley actually used, so much of the money, right, that she made making textiles, right, and making fabric and fashions, for Southern women across the South, to buy her own freedom, which is how she became such a beloved and important advisor, right, to Lincoln. She had a whole lot to do, with his drafting of the Emancipation Proclamation. So Nazi's inclusion, of this fabric, and the cotton itself, you know, says a whole lot, about how rooted his work is, right, in the broader history, of both, Africans on the continent. We'll get to that in a minute, but African Americans throughout the South. The black shoes also root the figure like firmly in the mid 20th century. So as much as this piece is really discussing and kind of talking about the presence in the process, right, of moving from Africa to the States, right, from freedom to slavery. It also moves us into the 20th century and the civil rights movement, right? So it's basically like from freedom to slavery back to freedom, right? So it's very much so full circle here, right? As you go down the figure's body. For myself, what I love most, about this piece is that it really gives us a sense of our own homes, right? Like how many of us, grew up with living rooms, right? With the same objects, our grandmothers, mothers, aunts, right? Great aunts, had mantles or china cabinets, right? Or floor model TVs that didn't work no more, right? That we put or that right, that they put these objects on, whether they were, um, old family photos, right? Um, the china, that they may have collected, from flea markets or even passed down, in some of our families. I think about my mother's, love of British willowware, before I even knew what willowware was, right? She had tons of it, that she would get at flea markets. I love the way that Naji really uses this work in the show itself to help us kind of see like what we know we can recognize, right? It's like seeing ourselves, not just in the fact that it's like black art by a black artist, but the fact that like our stories, right, how we live, has a whole lot to do, with the way in which black culture functions, right? It starts in our own homes, right? So many of these rooms, so many of these bodies, right? Were our first encounters, or experiences, right, with art collecting, and honestly, curation, before we knew really what curation was, right? I know my mom definitely did it, but I'm sure, all of yours did as well. Our moms and our grandmothers, curated the hell, right? Out of our living rooms and again, parlor rooms, the front room, right? Which is why we couldn't take our asses in there, right? Fooling around and playing, right? Get out my front room, right? It was always that one room, right, that we couldn't go in. Um, because there was a type of sacred to those places and those rooms. And I think from Beale to Bourbon Street, Nazi really illustrates that, right? Illustrating the way in which these were almost religious spaces for and in some cases, in some cases they actually were, right? Like if I know like my father's side of the family, for instance, my granddad, was kind of like a little jackleg preacher. And he would have his, sermons, right? He would have his little services in these rooms. So it's like it's really interesting that it's not just a living history, right? Like this is us, right? This is us as Black folks, particularly those of us, who really hail from the South. Another striking detail of Time Traveler is the cluster of nails embedded into the top of the torso, which directly references the powerful tradition of Nkizi and Kandi figures from the Kondo people of Central Africa. These spiritually charged objects, sometimes called power figures, were created as repositories of ancestral energy and protection. The nails driven into the figures were acts of activation. Each insertion sealed an oath, invoked justice, and or secured a communal promise. Nazi's adaptation of this motif connects the diasporic thread between Western Central African spiritual practices and the ways that African American communities in the South have carried forward similar traditions of memory, protection, and reclamation. The embedded nails in Time Traveler evoke both ancestral wounds and the enduring will to heal and resist. By reimagining the Nkisi within a contemporary assemblage, Naji reminds viewers that the Black body is not just a site of historical trauma, right, but an active conduit of resilience and generational power. The piece becomes an act of spiritual grounding, an instance, right, that our stories, like these nails, anchor us in collective memory and action. Another key work in this show that really references the idea, right, and the sacredness or concept of our living rooms, right, or black parlor rooms, is actually called The Listening. In this piece, Naji conjures a richly layered interior that is both domestic but also deeply ancestral. The room vibrates with color, patterned historical presence, right? The ornate wallpaper, a vintage phonograph, many frame family portraits, an old grandfather clock, like they all converge, right? To evoke this timeless space where Black memory and creativity coalesce. A young boy stands before an elder, with his purple toned skin marking him as a figure of like otherworldly wisdom, who sits confidently, right, with this cane that embodies a bridge between the past and future generations. Dorsey's iconography here, between the older figure and the little boy really signifies Harry Oswaldana's banjo lesson. I think it does a lot, right, to think about, African oral traditions, African American oral traditions, right, and how we're passing things down. So we're in Tanner's piece, the grandfather is passing down the actual ability, right, to play the banjo or a stringed instrument. In Najee's piece, the older figure is passing down the appreciation, right, of blues and jazz. And not only is the younger, the young boy here able to uh take in, right, the sound or like, sort of black cultural sonic history, he's also able to listen, right, to this elder figure that also kind of doubles, right, as a spiritual ancestor. Najee's careful curation, of the objects themselves. So the records, the gramophone, the photos that line the wall, like all of this stuff, right, speaks to the significance of sound, image, and storytelling in Black cultural life. The listening room is a portal of sorts. It's a space where the power of the blues and jazz traditions seep through everyday detailed, objects, reminding us that Black music has always been, right, a vessel for resistance, as well as a portal, into joy, and communal survival, right? For decades, for us. Even the way in which the blues predates jazz, right? Jazz kind of grows, well, not kind of, right? Jazz grew out, right, of the blues tradition. And so both pieces, right? The kind of 3D, sculptural piece, as well as, this digital collage, Najee really demonstrates, right, the multidimensionality, of Black life and Black culture. From Beale to Bourbon Street invites us to sit, remember, and truly listen to the stories that hold us, to the rooms that shelter those stories, and to the ancestors whose voices still resonate through us. The exhibition is now on view at Black Art in America's gallery, and it's in its last week. So I highly encourage you to experience it in person if you're in the Atlanta area. And if you're interested in collecting, these works are really powerful. And so many more, in the Baya collection can be additions that carry our history into your own home. To learn more, visit blackartinamerica.com. And as usual, keep supporting Black businesses, and Black artists and Black spaces that keep our stories alive. For now, that is it for me, and I will see you next time.